justice system. We're going to find our way out of here together. Put his hand on the glass to say goodbye, picked up his briefcase, turned around, and ran right into the wall.
Oh, Jesus.
Not
True
a good
story.
sign.
Oh, you weren't real confident in
Not a
that.
good sign.
Well, you know, guys, he was right. I was in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, because he was your lawyer. That was the
Presumably,
yeah.
you couldn't
True story.
afford. You couldn't afford a criminal defense
I could not.
because we have unequal justice in America. Because poor people get public defenders. That
I could not. I asked. We had asked F. Lee Bailey if he wouldn't mind taking the case. I had talked to some of the most powerful lawyers in the country, but none of them would. For F. Lee Bailey wanted $100,000 just to fill his plane up to come and see me.
Yeah.
I wound up with the directionally challenged attorney.
So,
And the trial was 2 weeks long.
I presume you made
2 weeks. 2 weeks
very
long.
clear to your lawyer that you were innocent.
I did. I told, as a matter of fact, Mark, I told everyone and anyone that I ever spoke to in my entire life in this whole ordeal that I was an innocent man. And I used to sign my correspondence through jail that way. Respectively submitted, Kirk Noble Bloodsworth, A period, I period, N period.
And let me ask you, Kirk. I mean, you said you were newly married, right?
Yes.
Yeah. What happened to your wife during all of this time? I mean,
She left. Basically 2 weeks later, she was living with somebody else, and I was all alone. It was just my parents, my mom, and my dad. And
where did they live? Were they in the area at all?
no, I'm from the Eastern Shore. I grew up in Cambridge, Maryland, a little small seaside town where I was a commercial crabber all my life. I was a waterman, and my family grew up in I think Garland was talking about this earlier, that my family has an island in Chesapeake Bay named after it. It's Bloodsworth Island. We don't own it anymore.
I understand.
The Navy owns it.
Kirk, let me ask you this. At the trial, was it brought out that the two little boys initially, one picked number 3 and one didn't say anything else?
Yes, it was all brought out. And I had 10 alibi witnesses that day.
And
I never left the house.
And the only evidence they had against you was that these boys, 2 weeks after first being showed the lineup,
that's the main parts of it. They said that, this is the guy. They showed them my photographs. They made them do this composite sketch. Now, one of the things, Mark, and you being an attorney, I don't know if you're familiar with this or not. Well, when you make a composite sketch.
I don't do a lot of criminal work.
Okay, well, maybe Garland. But when you do a composite sketch, you put one witness in a room, you put the other witness in the other room, and you hope that the composites match, right? If you have a person of interest. Now, the problem with that is the littlest of the two boys couldn't do it. The oldest one wasn't quite happy with it. As a matter of fact, in the photograph, when he picked my picture out, he said, well, the hair is too red. He even mentioned that. And then...
that was brought out of trial?
Well, yes. And then they brought the two witnesses, because the youngest couldn't do the composite, brought them together in the same room to agree on the older boy's composite sketch.
Which is totally against...
And everything in law enforcement that I have known in my life, in the last, I've been out now 19 years this June, so been going through this since 1984. You never do that. That is like...
Let me ask you, Robert, you're ex-law enforcement. Is that...
Let me just ask you a question. You're talking about the kids there. And, prior to this, I mean, is there political pressure to wrap this case up real quick?
Absolutely. You're talking about one of the most vicious murders in state's history. I became the most hated man in the state of Maryland in 1984. I was 22 years old. Never been arrested and charged. And look, they had suspects in the area. They had one guy by the name of Kimberly Shea Ruffner who was let go 2 weeks before Dawn's murder. And there was a police report 8 days before my arrest about this guy. They never went to check. They had another guy by the name of Captain Bob who was traveling around in a van trying to get kids to come to the car. This is like known sex offenders in this area. Nobody checked. And of course, they had a tip line of like 500 some calls. My call came in about me from my next door neighbor. I was called 286. It looks like my neighbor Kirk. That's how this all became started, because of a finger.
Really, really scary.
And the prosecutors and the cops just kept on pushing.
I want to ask you about police procedure, because Kirk says that the cops would come together and allow the witnesses to compare the story, compare the composites. Did you ever deal with criminal cases like this? Is this proper procedure?
Let me say this. I was a law enforcement officer for 27 years. I can remember seeing cases where I saw I know what he's talking about. I mean, think of it like this. If you go to a car mechanic, you may have a good mechanic, or you may go to some guy and say, man, what a bonehead. Well, there are cops like that too, that start a case, and this is what I've seen happen. When someone starts a case, and they determine from the beginning, they get a suspect, and in their mind they determine, I used to teach investigations, I would always argue against this. They would, from the beginning, they would see a suspect, and they would, in their mind, that's the right person. And the entire investigation was not to find the truth, it was to prove that that was the person that did it, and it certainly appears to me that that's what happened. But let me remind all of our listeners, listen to WPFW 89.3 FM here in Washington, D.C. We are at the Busboys and Poets.
We'd love to see you.
Yeah, here in Hyattsville.
You can meet Kirk Bloodsworth yourself. He's a very fine gentleman.
Kirk Bloodsworth. That's right.
5331 Baltimore Avenue, right in the center of Hyattsville.
And in case you're just listening...
There's no traffic either. I mean, I drove here, no problem.
And in case you're just listening in on this conversation, Kirk Bloodsworth was wrongfully convicted of a murder. He spent 8 years and 11 months in jail, 2 years on death row, and finally he was the first person in the United States who was exonerated and released from death row due to DNA evidence.
And let's get into that only for the sake of time. Now, you've been in prison, you've been doing a lot of legal work yourself, you were able to get another trial, you got not exonerated, but freed from the death sentence to a life sentence. But DNA wasn't being used for evidence here in this country. I mean, this actually, you discovered it happening in England.
Yeah, I had read a book by Joseph Womble about the first time it was ever used, and there was this guy by the name of Alec Jeffries who, you talk about how brain payments. This guy, he mastered organic chemistry at the age of 11. He's the one that is the father of modern genetic fingerprinting. To make a long story short, they did a DNA test of the entire town of this town in Narborough, England. They were looking for a child killer over there. They had like 5,000 men they tested between the ages of 25 and 35 years of age. Now, when the test came back, they were blank. 2 days later, though, in a pub, in a bar, in a restaurant, not unlike this one, somebody overheard a friend of someone bragging that he took his DNA test for somebody else. And that guy he took it for was Colin Pittsburgh, the first person ever convicted in the world behind genetic fingerprinting. That's when my epiphany came.
How long before you discovered this had this happen?
It happened right in the mid-'80s, right around that time.
But our police departments were not willing to use this as evidence at all. DNA
was in its infancy. It was like in 1986, Gary Dobson became the first person ever acquitted or ever exonerated behind genetic fingerprinting. I became the first death row or capital conviction ever acquitted.
Was there actual resistance by the police departments and the prosecutors to use DNA?
Well, here's the really scary part. I had thought about this. I was like freaking out. If he can convict you, he can free you. I'm thinking of all these things. I'm reading all these reports about many spermatozoa found on the scene, on different underclothes and different things of Dawn's, and I just had to get these things tested. So I wrote the prosecutor, Ann Brobst, who was a prosecutor in Baltimore County, and who's a judge now, by the way. And I said, I want to take this new testing. She wrote me back a letter. She said, Mr. Bloodsworth, I regret to inform you that the DNA has been inadvertently destroyed.
What?
Wait a minute. Yeah. Wait for it. Listen. And then she said, and I told my lawyer, he's a judge now in Washington, D.C. His name is Bob Moore. And he had said, Kirk, it's not there. I can't find the evidence. They destroyed it. And so I said, well, look, go back and check one more time. So he went back and checked, and sure enough, it wasn't in the evidence room where it was